Good. Okay, so back to this. Why and how he does it. Welcome, Henry. Hello. Welcome to Polk Salad, where we will have a bounty of conversation today. My name is Terry Gregory, and I have three amazing guests, all writers, right here from Monmouth and Independence, with very different stories, very different books. The books are all nonfiction, they're all important, and they're all very interesting people. So when I tell you that I'm excited about these guests, I'm not sure I can convey how I truly feel about it. So please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Polk Salad, where we, as promised, have three wonderful guests today, all local, all writers, all from right here in our community. And so without any further ado, I want to get started right here with Betty Plude, who comes to us this morning from Independence. Good morning, Betty.
Good morning.
It's so nice to have you here.
I'm excited to be here.
Now, I've only been in the area for about 8 years, but ever since I first got here, I've heard your name, because you're involved with, tell me, I'm going to leave something out, Friends of the Library, the Library Board, what else?
Not the library board, Friends of the Library Board, the school board.
School Board.
Volunteer at Dallas Retirement Village, doing interviews for 8 years, and their newsletters and all that. And lunch buddy at IES for 8 years. And some of those lunch buddies are still my buddies today.
Oh, don't make me cry.
And they're in their 20s.
Too early. Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, you're very involved in the community. And one of the other things I heard about first off when I moved here was the Columbus Day storm.
Right.
And you know, everybody would talk about it like it was a given. Like where I'm from, you talk about Hurricane Betsy or whatever, you know, and everybody knows that you could say Betsy and everybody knows exactly what you're talking about. But I felt out of the loop because people refer to it all the time, and I didn't know what it was. And you sort of fixed that for us. You wrote a book about the Columbus Day storm.
And I haven't seen where anybody else these days did that. This was the only one.
Right. Tell me about that storm, first of all.
Well, I don't know real big details about the storm. I can tell you how I decided to do this.
Okay.
Well, I teach writing your life story. And I've taught it in other states and a lot in Oregon. And every time in Oregon, when I was teaching life story classes, the storm would always come up. And being on the Friends of the Library Board, I'm the chairman there, and so I'm the fundraiser. I thought this would be a great fundraiser for the library, hearing all these stories. And when I'd turn a story in after I'd get it, John Seedy, he put it all together like this, and then the print shop here at the college printed it all. We're in our 3rd edition right now.
Oh, my goodness.
But I'd send more stories, and then John would say, aren't you ready to stop? Aren't you? So I can't, everybody that called or the stories were awesome. So at conferences where I taught, I would ask for stories, and of course they were all so excited about it. And Justin Much did an awesome article in the Statesman Journal, and showed a picture of one of the statues at the Capitol that went over.
Oh, my.
And that, after that article came out, I got calls from everywhere.
Oh, my.
And,
even from outside of Monmouth Independence.
Right, yeah. All these stories are from Northern California clear up to Canada. That's the storm
right?
did that.
I did not realize that.
Yeah.
Did you live here during that storm?
No.
When did you move
The
here?
writing you say I did in here, the only writing I did was in the beginning. And
Okay.
so I tell about when the storm was going on, my oldest son, Todd, was 1 month old. And so I was changing diapers while they were going through all these experiences.
And so were you a teacher? Is that
No.
how you started this writing?
No, I worked for City Hall in Carlsbad, California for years, and San Marcos. And I did a cookbook called Romance with North San Diego Counties, and I interviewed all those restaurants, and they had to be not chains. And I got all their stories and some recipes, and that got me writing.
Is that right? And then you started doing the writing of people's stories.
Yeah, and then I started going to conferences, writers' conferences, and then I started with my mom, actually. And I learned something, if anybody's listening, if you interview people and you have a husband and a wife or whatever, don't ever interview them together, because they would say, "Oh, that isn't how it was," or "that it was." But everybody sees something different,
So true.
differently. So
there's a lot of research about that, about
right.
how memories
Yeah.
change even as they
Yeah.
every time the telling of the story happens.
One of my favorite conference leaders, Jerry Jenkins, he did all the Left Behinds,
Yes.
and he wrote Billy Graham's story. You would never know it because his name isn't in the book, but he spent a year with Billy Graham, and he wrote the book. And he said he'd be interviewing Billy Graham, and Ruth Graham would be in the other room. "Billy, that isn't the way it was."
I can imagine that.
Yeah.
True.
So, but it was awesome. But
So, what's
anyway.
one of your favorite stories from this book?
Well, one that I keep, one actually, the guy works in the bookstore here at the college, and Dave Morris. And he lived over in Eastern Oregon, and it was a football game that night. And they'd kick the ball. It wasn't like it was here on the west, but it was windy over there. So they would kick the ball to do a punt, and when they kicked it that way, it went back that way.
Oh, my.
So then they just started running the ball. But one story that sticks out is a lady left her house with her children in a little Volkswagen. No, sounds grammatically wrong. She got in her Volkswagen and went to her sister's house. She thought they'd be safer over there. And she parked in the driveway that was on an angle. And she got to the front door, and all of a sudden they heard a noise. And they turned around, and here was her Volkswagen going backwards back down the driveway.
Oh, my. Yeah, I've heard people say they've had lots of experiences. It seems like for people who lived in the area at that time, that day is stuck in their memory.
Yep.
Stuck in their memory. And I'm sure it was wonderful for them to have an outlet, to finally feel like, oh, get to tell this story and get it out there. And it lives on, you know?
Yep. And then after it was out, the book was out, and people would approach me and say, "I didn't know you were doing a book." And if you don't read the newspaper the day it's out there, you miss it.
Right.
And I have heard more stories since this book has been published that we could do another whole book.
Are you
but
going
I'm
to?
done.
You knew that was my next question.
It was fun. It was great. It took 3 years for me
Yeah.
to get 215 stories.
Right.
But it was, I met so many people. It was just an awesome experience. And the people that helped, and the editors, and
I'm going to
all
hold
that.
this up just in case
Okay.
our viewers could see it past the desk. I don't know. But and where can they get this book?
You can get it at the Independence Library, and I don't think I told it at the beginning. I did. Oh, for a fundraiser for the
Yeah.
library. It was a fundraiser for the Friends of the Library, and I talked to Robin and told her, I want to do this so that when you do an addition to the library, which they could use already.
Robin, the librarian in
Library
Independence.
is the, yes, and I said, I want to do this because I want all the money to go into an account for when they do the addition to the library, and kind of be seed money or something.
Right, because boy,
Yeah.
that library is bustling.
It's busy.
Every time I go
Right.
in there, there's so many wonderful things
It's a
happening.
wonderful
in
library.
that little building. So this is called Columbus Day Storm, 1962 Memories, stories compiled by Betty Chapman Plude. And Betty has done a service to the whole community by offering this. And you could pick up your copy at the Independence Library and know that it's going to a good cause. So I can see now why I heard your name so much. You're always doing such wonderful things in our community. And you live in the air park, don't you, in
Right.
Independence?
And then we have a new thing going where it's Scrabble with Betty, so you can come to the library and at the first Wednesday of every month and play Scrabble.
The first Wednesday of every month at what time?
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock to play Scrabble with Betty. I saw that and
In
I'm
the paper, in the
I'm too
IO.
intimidated. I saw it in the IO and I thought, my mom loved Scrabble. And I played it somewhat, but I'm certainly not an expert.
Yeah.
Sounds like you guys have a really good time.
We do. We laugh a lot. And the reporter, Emily, came and interviewed, and she played. And it was so fun to watch her, too, because I could see him down at the other end of the table doing high fives and just having a great time. And she did a great article, and she put in there also about dementia and everything, too. So that's
Because
a big thing.
that helps.
There's
Doing
so many
crossword puzzles, playing Scrabbles,
Yeah, right.
helps sort of ward off.
It gives them respite time if they come and join us at
Thank
the library.
you. Thank
Okay.
you so much for writing
You're
this
welcome.
book
Oh, it was
for
a
the
great project.
community.
Right.
And thank you so much for agreeing to come out in somewhat of a storm this morning. and
right.
Be here.
Well, these stories, as I said, are all the way from Northern California to through Canada. So
Because it was a giant storm, I guess.
it was. It came in San Francisco. They had to cancel the World Series that day.
Is that right?
And then it just worked up the coast all the way up.
all
and
the
through
way
here.
up the coast, all the way to Canada. Raging winds.
Yeah,
It,
yeah.
it toppled some things here on campus. That there was a
Oh, yeah.
famous picture in Time magazine, I believe, of
Right,
of the
Wes
Campbell Hall.
Lucho. Yeah, he went around all year with me speaking. We've been all year, not this, well, we just did the
photographer?
Lions Club. Right.
The one who took
And his
that
picture's
picture.
in here, yeah, with that
tell
camera and
ya.
everything. He was standing right on the stairs here at the
Yeah.
college. And anyway, we just spoke at Lions Club on Columbus Day Storm this year. I think that's it now. I think we're done.
Never say never.
Never, right? I know,
Never
I've
say
learned
never.
that.
Well, thank you.
Thank
It
you.
seems like your experience teaching and gaining and gathering
Mm-hmm.
information really helped make this book very authentic and very widespread in its reach. So thank you very much
Mm-hmm. Thank
for being
you.
here this
Thank
morning.
you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you for being here with me and Betty. And you stay right where you are. We'll be right back. Thanks so much for sticking around for our next guest. You're going to be very glad you did. Maybe some of you have never even heard of what this gentleman does for us and what he has written right here in our community. We have with us this morning Todd Jarvis, and I'm not going to take any more time. I'm just going to jump right in and let Todd tell you about what he did and why he did it. Thanks for being here, Todd.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah.
Well, my book is titled Contesting Hidden Waters, Conflict Resolution over Groundwater and Aquifers. And the purpose of my book was to try to fill a gap within the conflict resolution literature, focusing exclusively on conflicts over groundwater and the uses of aquifers, simply because that's where the lion's share of freshwater resources in the world are located. But we never really think too much about them because it's all hidden.
That's right. And I guess, this water is like a huge hot topic in the world today, right?
Well-
and many of us really don't know that because we turn on our tap and we have water.
Right.
So explain a little bit, if you can, about why this is such a big deal.
Okay, sure. Well, in the Willamette Valley, we're quite spoiled because we have an abundance of water, and for the foreseeable future, it looks like we're in pretty good shape. But elsewhere in the world, we're not in such great shape with respect to water. I think we often see in mainstream media, in the news, regularly the California drought is very serious, and that's probably one of the best examples of where my book comes in, because the state of California is very dependent on groundwater for agriculture, and they're literally running out. We can see them running out of water using technology from satellites.
Wow. What's the non-layman's term, or the layman's term for groundwater, the definition for that term? Is it just
Well, it's
water
just-
that seeps up?
Well, I think most people can connect to groundwater through springs. Hot springs are groundwater. Just springs that we cherish, where fish typically try to breed.
I see.
In Oregon, many people rely on individual water wells. There's over 250,000 wells in the state, so people will make that connection to groundwater as well.
Right, right. So tell us how it is that you came to be in this industry.
Well, I'm a geologist, and then I received a master's degree in groundwater hydrology, and then I worked for about 20 years in the groundwater engineering industry, and I started to see more and more emphasis on conflicts over groundwater.
Now, who would the conflicts be between, per se?
People that rely on it to increase their wealth. Land developers became very dependent on it for their subdivisions, for their golf courses. Agriculture is very dependent on it for their livelihoods. People that care a lot about fish, they rely on groundwater because it's almost the perfect resource, because the water that comes out of the ground has almost a unique and consistent chemistry as well as temperature, and that's why the fish like it. But then there's also the spiritual values associated with groundwater. Many cultures think that groundwater has a connection to God.
That's interesting. Do you write about that a little bit in your book?
I do, actually. A lot of people are probably familiar with the concept of water witching or dowsing,
Yes.
and that's quite conflictive. The conflict is primarily between geologists and water witches, but I do talk a little bit about a personal conflict. Many of the case studies in my book are personal case studies, conflicts that I was involved with, and I tried to figure out a way to portray even the simplest groundwater conflict, which would be water witching and dowsing, and to show that these can be resolved peacefully.
That's interesting. So one of the saddest things I've ever seen is one time I was going down I-5 to California, and I saw a whole orchard that was just shriveled up. And there was a big sign that said, stop taking our water. And I would guess that has a lot to do with, I didn't know, I'm ignorant. I knew there was a drought in California, but there seems to be a way that people can stop water too. Is that through dams? I mean,
Well,
is that how primarily someone would say this is my water and dam up something?
the water rights situation in the United States is very complex. It varies considerably from east to west. And even within the western United States, the water rights situation is quite complex. But in California, they have a really unique water system that stretches from Northern California to Southern California through a series of canals and levees and dams. And there's been quite a bit of debate over who has primacy with respect to that water, irrigated agriculture or endangered species. And
Wow.
that's the lion's share of the conflict in California right now is do we give the water to the folks who grow our food, or do we try to protect little tiny fish in the San Francisco Bay?
Yeah, and so it's so interesting to me as a person who, like many of our viewers, just don't know much about this or think about it. So you have so much knowledge, and to me it looks like the water freely comes from the sky, and then we decide somehow where it should go.
Right. Well, it has a lot to do with how the West was settled. Whoever arrived in the western United States first got to lay claim to the water first. And that's the way it works primarily throughout the western United States is first in time, first in right. But many of the water rights laws that were developed throughout the western United States never thought that leaving water in a river was beneficial, that they wanted to see all the water used. And it wasn't until, in the past 25 or 30 years that we started to recognize that there is value in leaving water in rivers and trying to protect springs because it's not only important for amenities, we like to be around water, but also for the fish and also for just the spiritual value of water.
Having water around. Can you give us an example of someone who may hire you to help them with a conflict resolution?
Sure. I spend a lot of time working internationally. I've been working both in the Middle East and in Africa, and people are very dependent on groundwater in these very arid regions. But there's a lot of competition over the water, not only between people and countries, but also between industries. For example, I was in Botswana, and the competition for groundwater there is not only between the people who rely on the groundwater. In Botswana, they're about 80% dependent on groundwater, but also the diamond mining industry uses an awful lot of water. So there's a lot of tension with respect to how to share that water to not only continue promoting health, but also economic health.
So is that an outside industry or like an indigenous industry for the most part, diamond mining? Are the Africans doing that? Or
These are multinational companies. They're gigantic mines. My guess is most of the companies are based probably in that region, Botswana, as well as in South Africa.
Right. So tell us, if you can, how is it that you came to be a geologist? Were you interested in that as a kid?
I was. My father introduced me to the world's largest mineral hot spring located in central Wyoming, Thermopolis, which means obviously hot water city. It's a very large spring. I was about 8 years old, and I was fascinated with how the water stank. It stank like rotten eggs. It was very, very hot, lots of steam. It was also fun to swim in.
So you could get in it.
They had commercial pools that you could swim in. Then my parents had a follow-up trip to Yellowstone, which you don't go to Yellowstone to see the moose and the bears. You go there to see the hot water. And so I was 11 years old, and that's when I decided that I was really keen on geology. But I really didn't know much about the water industry at that point in time. I just knew that I was fascinated with it.
You were fascinated with this. And why does it stink like rotten eggs?
It has a lot to do with if the water is coming in contact with hydrocarbons. So it could be a function of being hydraulically connected to an oil reservoir, which many of the springs in the vicinity of Thermopolis are connected to oil fields. It can also be a function of just bacteria.
So water, it sounds like, is not only needed for life, for growing plants and for amenities, but it's also a power, right? I mean, it can produce electricity or power for us too. I mean,
You're right. Well, there's a power in many different senses, not only electrical power, but also economic and political power. And that's part of the tension as well. And that's what, at Oregon State University where I work, we try to train our students that the water business is more than just pumps and pipes, that you have to be, as an engineer or a scientist, you also have to be well-versed in professional communication and conflict management, because water is such an emotionally charged substance.
it is. And there's so much, apparently, from the little I'm hearing from you today, which I'm sure just scratches the surface of what you could tell us. It's complex and interesting to everybody. I mean, on some level. Who do we know that doesn't use water? You know what I mean?
That's true.
I mean,
it sounds a little cliche to say it, water is life, but I mean,
Right.
that it truly is.
Right.
All life is dependent on water. And I think that's one of the things that intrigues me most, is that it's been a wonderful career in working with technology, but it's also been a wonderful career in bridging gaps between people. It really is one of those substances that allows people to come together.
Right, yeah. Does your business have anything to do with the ecology of water, like keeping it clean in the big way, like the oceans and that sort of thing? Because it goes up and comes down, as is, I guess.
Well, most of my work, and this is also portrayed in the book, my book, is how to protect the quality of groundwater. The groundwater has enormous value to municipalities because it typically doesn't need to be treated through very expensive treatment plants. So that's part of the issue, is that it has enormous value from the standpoint of trying to preserve the quality. And so there's a lot of tension associated with trying to protect the water quality, because it's under the ground, you can't see it, and it's typically underneath somebody's private property, or it's underneath, if a municipality is relying on an aquifer, many times the recharge area is outside of their jurisdiction, and that creates some tension. Probably the most fascinating conflict, though, for me, is the tension between scientists, because we're dealing with a field where much of our work is dependent on how good our imaginations are. And so it's very interesting to see.
How so?
Well, we can't see it. We're working in the subsurface. We typically try to create conceptual models, what's going on in the subsurface, using borehole logs. In Oregon, we're blessed in that the Oregon Water Resources Department has posted all the borehole logs online.
I don't know what that is.
It's-
Any place the
Yeah,
hole is
anywhere
bored.
there's a
Got it.
borehole that's drilled, there's a log, meaning how many feet of soil and rock and what have you, what's the depth of water. All of that information is of great value to scientists. And when we try to connect the dots in the subsurface to the surface, not all of our dots necessarily connect the same way.
I see.
And so we can have dueling experts, which I try to describe that problem in the book. I think groundwater is probably more susceptible to the dual and expert situation than probably any other scientific debate, except for maybe climate change.
Right. Right. Well, I could see that. And water's a part of that too, but we won't
Yes.
go into that because we only have a little bit more time left. But you personally have, I mean, you were born around water, weren't you? I mean, water's just been a part of your life.
Right.
Weren't you
well,
born
I was born in Newfoundland.
Yeah.
Right, St. John's, Newfoundland. So yes, there's a lot of water in that area.
Isn't that interesting? I just think that's so interesting. You were born surrounded by water, and now you work in this industry, helping all of us with that water. So tell me, I think a lot of people from our discussion today are going to want to take a look at that book and get a bit more educated about what's going on in the world. How can they get the book?
Well, it's easy to order online through a broad spectrum of vendors. Routledge is the publisher, and so it can be purchased directly through Routledge. Amazon.com obviously is a resource.
And the name of the book one more time?
Contesting Hidden Waters.
Contesting Hidden Waters. And it's just come out this year?
It came out in June 2014.
And it sounds like not only something that's helping us all, but something that's really dear to your being, your heart, not only what you do, right? I get a sense that you're one of those people who, I don't want to speak for you, but organically what you love has become what you do.
Well,
Would that be fair to say?
I think that's a pretty good assessment, sure.
Yeah.
Saw right through me, Tara.
Which I love. I tell you, I love it when people love what they do and it becomes sort of the gift to all of us, which I feel like your book is. And so thank you very much for being here to share that with us today, taking your time out. You're a professor at OSU and you do many, many things. You also work in the world of water and conflict resolution. And so it's not like you're just sitting around looking for things to do. So I appreciate you being here on Polk Salad this morning very much.
I appreciate the invitation, Terry.
Good. So now you have the information you need to learn what you want to about water and the role it plays. And also there's contact information for Todd here in the book and in other areas if you'd like to have more discussion about that. Thank you very much for being here with us. Stay tuned. We have one more very exciting guest, and we'll be right back. Hey there, welcome back. I can't honestly say that we've saved the best for last because we've had such fabulous guests on this morning. But you are going to be so happy that you stuck around with us to hear our next guest. Kimberly Jensen is a professor of history at Western Oregon University, right here in our community. And she not only does that and many other things, but she's written a book that we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to let her tell you all about that. And now, thank you for being here with us,
Oh,
Kimberly.
Terry, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the
Yeah.
invitation.
So how long have you been here at Western?
I've been here at Western since 1993.
My goodness.
So a brief time.
Oh, that's a good while, right?
It's a good while, and I love being here at Western. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
And you're teaching all these students about history.
Yeah, I teach in the history department, and we also have a gender studies minor. So a lot of my work is in women's history, and so it's wonderful to be able not only to research that field, but also teach it.
And to write about it. Tell us the name of your book.
So my latest book is Oregon's Doctor to the World, Esther Pohl Lovejoy and a Life in Activism.
Wow. Esther Pohl Lovejoy.
Yeah.
And what made you so interested in this one? Because you study probably, I mean, I couldn't even put a number on how many women who've made an impact that you've studied about. Why was this one so special?
Well, in my first book was a study of U.S. women in World War I. And I found Esther Lovejoy, not only, she was a subject, she was in France on behalf of U.S. medical women trying to find out what service they could provide. There were about 6,000 women doctors, can you believe it, in the nation in 1917. But she also, so she was a subject of the book, but also she, in later life, was a historian of women in medicine. And so her book, Women Doctors of the World, was also a source for me.
I see.
And so I did that research. When I came to Oregon, I found that her papers had been fairly recently donated to the historical collections and archives, the sort of the archives
Is she an
at
Oregonian?
OHSU. She was an Oregonian.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so her papers were there, and I thought, wow, I wonder if there's enough material for a biography. And that, combined with lots of other research, made that possible.
Wow.
Yeah.
So where was she from in Oregon?
Well, she was born in Seabeck, Washington Territory, and then she lived in Portland, and she was one of the first women at what is now OHSU.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, and so she was very involved in the campaign for Votes for Women in Oregon, which they were successful by 1912. She was the first woman to run for U.S. Congress from Oregon, so she was very, very interested in making a political difference as well as a medical
I
difference.
see. Now, what brought you to Oregon?
My wonderful job.
Yeah. And where from?
I'm from Denver.
You're from Denver.
Yeah, so the West is it's still the West.
Yeah, it's still the West,
Yeah.
not too far from home. Well, I guess now this is home.
It's very much home.
Right,
That's right.
And we're so lucky to have you here doing what
Oh,
you're doing.
no, it's my pleasure. So the other part that I think fascinated me about Lovejoy was that she was someone who took her Portland and her Oregon activism and then took that to the international arena. So in World War I, she found that there were women doctors from many countries who had been interested in doing the same kind of things that she'd been doing, working in public health, trying to make their communities safer, working for women and children. And so she was one of the organizers and the first president of the Medical Women's International Association, because she realized that there was all of this talent and all of this potential for women doctors to really make a difference and to influence not only national policies but also international policy for health.
because she probably, I'm guessing, through the war expanded her own horizons of who was out there.
That's right.
And who was doing what.
That's right, and she also, U.S. women doctors were wanted to have officer status in the medical corps during World War I, and they were unsuccessful with that. So they didn't let that stop them. They created their own female-only medical units. And the one that she worked with was organized through the Medical Women's National Association. And so they wanted to showcase their skills. They wanted to show that women doctors were very capable.
Right.
And so when the war was over, there was a question about, well, will this, should we keep this American Women's Hospital? Should we disband? What should we do? And she felt very strongly that, particularly because she saw in Europe that the treaty didn't mean that the war was over.
Right.
That and she was right. I mean, this is the long war of the 20th century and beyond.
Right.
And so she was the director of the American Women's Hospitals, the organization, the sort of subset of the Medical Women's National Association. So she turned that into a medical humanitarian organization, much like we're more familiar with Mercy Corps here
Right.
in Portland, Doctors Without Borders.
Now,
It's been so
was she
important.
in Portland doing that?
So she was in Portland through 1920, and then when she directed the American Women's Hospital, her headquarters was in New York City.
Oh, wow.
She came back to visit family. She, always considered Portland her home, but she was really based in New York, but traveled the world
Right.
after that. And she lived until she was 98. She lived until 1967, and so it was a very long career directing that organization, and it still exists today.
still exists today.
As does the Medical Women's International Association.
My
so.
goodness, no wonder you wrote a book.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody should know about this woman, it seems like.
Well, it's interesting because I think part of the reason Oregonians didn't know much more about her was that she did become someone who was working internationally and
Right.
left Portland. But my hope was to restore her contributions to Oregon as well as to the international
Oh,
scene.
that's a beautiful hope. Beautiful hope. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for putting that out there. I wondered, though, when during World War I, were women, how did they get there? They weren't drafted. Were they part of the military? Were they
Terry,
drafted?
how much time do you have?
No, look, you got to talk to me like a layperson and our audience. Where you're introducing us, it's like our previous guests. We could talk and have whole shows about this subject.
So one of the things that's important is that before World War I, women had been very active in their communities. Women's clubs, this is, historians call this the progressive era. So public health, running for, trying to get communities healthier, but also being involved in politics as well. And so Oregon women have the vote 8 years earlier than many other women do. And so there's this sense of that the war might be a way to show women's skills and capabilities. Women weren't drafted, although there were efforts to register women. I'm working on this for another book, so more later.
My
So women volunteered, but there were also women who were part of the military. They were part of the Navy and the Marine Corps. They were called yeomen, F for female.
Oh, wow.
Women were, actually Reed College trained women in what we would today call physical therapy and occupational therapy. They were called reconstruction aides.
Wow.
There were about 11,000 nurses.
Was this for the war effort?
Yeah.
Particularly.
Yeah. And nurses were the largest group and really very needed.
My goodness. So she had to volunteer for this position.
So she
didn't necessarily recruit women.
right, and so women doctors served on contract, and some women felt fine about that because it got them to France and serving. But a lot of doctors felt that because that was second class, they couldn't become part of the medical corps. They didn't want to do that contract service. They felt like that was a bit of selling out.
I see.
And so that's why the American Women's Hospitals, that all-female medical unit, that was all funded by contributions. And so that was a volunteer organization. And then the National Women's Suffrage Association also had an all-female medical unit as well.
Oh, wow. So just a little off. Women had the vote in Oregon 8 years before they did nationally. Is that true?
Well, women, so the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, but there were 13 states and territories before the war. But Oregon women could vote for national elections.
That was my question.
That's
they could
something
vote for national elections?
That's something that a lot of people don't know.
Interesting.
So yeah, they voted for president as well as
Way before
yeah.
everything
Yeah.
was. Oh, that's so interesting.
It's very
One
interesting.
more reason to love Oregon, right?
One more.
I mean, they're just, so you've written, tell me just briefly about your first book.
So that was called Mobilizing Minerva, American Women in the First World War.
And then the next one?
There was a book that I co-edited. It's an anthology of essays called Women and Transnational Activism in Historical Perspective. So looking at really, I have a chapter on her World War I work, really trying to think about how was it that women connected with other women and above and across national borders to try to make their communities
and
better.
I guess the war sort of instigated that, was the catalyst for that.
In some ways, but there were other, international organizations. The AAUW, for example, preceded the war.
For what?
The the American Association of University Women.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's great. I do a little research and stuff myself, and, ages ago, women, to be a scholar, you pretty much had to be a nun or in an abbey or something like that before, education finally caught on for, regular people out here in the world. So it's so interesting to me. It's just so interesting. Okay, and then your next book, your next project.
The project I'm working on now really comes from thinking about women in Oregon achieving the vote in 1912. So it's looking at citizenship, civil liberties, and also the surveillance state for women in Oregon from 1913 through the 20s. So World War I is back in there, but this is going to be a particular focus on Oregon. So looking at how various diverse women in Oregon thought about what citizenship meant, their claims to that, but also the idea of civil liberties, that there are rights of citizenship, but there are also civil liberties protection, protection of, safety in one's person is what the Universal Declaration says. And so those claims were really challenged, and particularly for women of color, for lesbians, for women who didn't have, the money to really do what Esther Lovejoy did. So I'm very interested in that. So looking at things like the next step was for many Oregon women was jury service, but it was really about trying to address violence against women. They wanted to be able to represent and support women, be a jury of their peers.
Because, I mean, I don't want to be too generalized and ignorant about it, but it was kind of a norm for some people to think of violence against women. Didn't really seem like violence, right? It was
That's
just
right.
The woman's role, not role, I'm not sure how to say that, but it was common.
It was common,
Yeah.
and also there were some sensational murder trials and so forth. But also I'm looking at the incarceration of women suspected of venereal disease during World War I.
Oh, wow, interesting.
Women who married men who were not U.S. citizens lost their U.S. citizenship. And so what does that mean when they're required to register and be surveilled as enemy aliens?
Oh, wow, that's so interesting.
And I'm also researching this growth of the surveillance state. So I've been looking at the FBI files, military intelligence,
goodness.
and it's really sad, but also I think a very important story because it's something that we think about every day today.
Yeah, that's
We're
right.
contending with and
It's-
grappling with these same issues.
Isn't that something that we still can that can be so current in our minds when we're looking so far back in history? That is amazing.
Well, and I
It
think
makes it so pertinent.
it makes it
not
pertinent.
just an interesting historical perspective, but applicable in certain ways today.
And I think that it's very important not to become discouraged and to say, well, why haven't we solved all these
Right.
problems? Because it tells us, I think, how deep-seated these conflicts are, how gendered ideas about gender roles are very powerful. Violence as a means to control is also very powerful. But also I think it's important to see that women and their supporters resisted, and to know that when we resist, that we're part of a long tradition.
Oh, that's beautiful. What a beautiful sentiment and truth. I wonder, it seems like you get to write and you get to teach students, which I know you love, here at this university. And how did that come about? Did you always want to be a professor or a writer?
I wanted to be lots of different things, but I think there were really two inspirations for me. One was my grandmother, whom I knew later in her life, in her 90s, because I was young. And she had been in the Red Cross in World War I, and she told me these stories, and I was very interested in that. But I also came of age during the women's movement, and I was very, very inspired by women who were willing to put themselves out there and to challenge inequities. And so I wondered about, other women in other historical periods. And so that was a very important part of that for me. And I think, so for me, this is very much a scholarly activity, but it's also very personal.
Well, right. What was your grandmother's name?
Her name was Mary Lindsay.
Mary Lindsay. And so putting that seed, I find so many people I talk to here, right here in the studio, there's somebody or something, and it's usually somebody telling them a story. It's not necessarily something they see, of this seed of possibility. Because I think even during the women's movement, if you didn't have someone, that seed in the back of your head, like, yeah, there are women who did stuff and who weren't restricted by this and who sort of did what they wanted to and needed to do. And, your grandma telling you those stories, I think it's magical.
I also think that as I talk with my students and as they're generous in sharing their experiences as well, I really think that's true, that there is that sense of inspiration. But also I think we can be inspired by people from the past and really have a strong connection with them. And I think one of the things that intrigued me about Esther Lovejoy was that she was born in a logging camp in Seebeck in really difficult circumstances. And she had a very difficult young life. Her father was an alcoholic who was very abusive, and she learned how to challenge authority. And she really took those lessons and refined them and got a lot of other skills, not only as a doctor, but as a campaigner, fundraiser, organizer. She worked well with people, I think. And so what's interesting to me is that a lot of our students wonder, well, I could never be like,
Right.
I could not do that.
Right.
And so I think it's important to see that it is possible. And I think biography can help us see how people have taken on challenges and
Absolutely.
made a difference.
It's one of my favorite genres. And thank you for your generosity in doing all this research to write a book.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I'm glad it's your pleasure because it's no small thing. Anyone who's ever written a book knows that. So thank you very much.
As you well know, Terry, thanks.
So thank you for sharing that with us and being willing to come here and take out time from your students and everything else that you're doing to share that with us.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for all you're doing for our community.
Oh, you're welcome. And how can people get your book?
People can get my book in a bookstore. They can get it online.
They could Google your name and see.
Oh, sure.
All your books will probably come up sooner or later.
They might, yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Terry.
Kimberly. Thanks for being here with us. If you need more information, you can contact Polk Salad through our Facebook page if you'd like, or you can get the numbers and the information that's been shown on the screen during our show. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll be right back. Thanks for coming back. Was I right or was I right? These people, thanks to Betty Plude, thanks to Todd Jarvis, thanks to Kimberly Jensen, who all shared just a little piece of their vast expertise on the subjects that they've written about. I hope that you were enlightened, interested, entertained, most of all inspired to get those books and find out more about these subjects that were so important, not only to our community, but in some cases to the world at large. So thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next time, and until then, I'll see you around town.